Good morning, everyone. Great crowd today. Really wonderful to see. Welcome to the Miller Center. I'm Mark Silverstone, Director and Professor of Presidential Studies here. And I am thrilled to be in conversation with you and with Charlie Trueheart this morning about Charlie's new book, which is really a remarkable account of the dawn of America's war in Vietnam and the intersection of that story, which runs essentially the early years of the 1960s, with those of his dad, Deputy Chief of Mission William C. Trueheart, and Frederick E. Nolting Jr., the U.S. Ambassador to South Vietnam. It is really quite amazing, and afterwards you can all purchase a copy of Charlie's book outside. We're especially thrilled to be in conversation about it this morning, the story of Bill and Fritz, because Fritz himself, after his years of government service, many years in fact after his years of government service, he became the founding director of the Miller Center itself. Diplomats at War, Friendship and Betrayal on the Brink of the Vietnam Conflict tells the story of Fritz Nolting and Bill Trueheart, how they wound up in Saigon, and how they managed an increasingly fraught relationship with the South Vietnamese government of Ngo Dinh Diem, whom the United States was supporting in an effort to preserve South Vietnam as an independent, non-communist state. The book also reveals how that very close friendship between Nolting and Trueheart, so close that Nolting was godfather to both Charlie and his brother Josh, how that friendship ruptured over policy towards Diem. Fritz and Bill never spoke to each other after their service in Vietnam ended, and the relationship was so tarnished that Bill essentially forbade Charlie from attending Fritz's funeral when Nolting died in 1989. So the book is really a remarkable, provocative, honest, and poignant account of that relationship, of the larger policy that the two sought to carry out, and Charlie's own views of those developments as a 12-year-old kid in Saigon, which is why he describes the book as a work of memory hiding inside a work of history. And I'm especially pleased to be speaking with Charlie here at the center, and not only because of the relationship with Fritz Nolting, but because Charlie's book appears in our Studies on the Presidency series, which I co-edit with my colleague Guian McKee, and which we publish with UVA Press. And I'd like to thank its representatives who are here with us today, Director Eric Brandt, Editor of History and Social Sciences Nadine Zimmerly, Assistant Editor Clayton Butler, and publicist Mary Kate Mako. Charlie Trueheart has spent a life in the world of letters and ideas, mostly as a journalist, working first for papers in Greensboro, North Carolina, and Baltimore, and at Publishers Weekly and USA Today. For 3 years in the 1980s, he was Associate Director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard and directed the John F. Kennedy School's Public Forum. He then spent 14 years at the Washington Post, serving as its chief writer on books, authors, publishing, literature, and intellectual issues, and also as a correspondent in Canada and Paris. In 2000, he began a stint as counselor and speechwriter for U.S. Ambassador to France Felix Rohatyn, and then from 2007 through 2017, he served as director of the American Library in Paris. We'll be in conversation for about 35-40 minutes today. We're hoping that you have questions yourself of Charlie. If you do, please write them down on the index cards at your seat. Alfred Reeves IV will pick them up. If you're watching online, please use the Q&A function via your Zoom connection, and away we go. Charlie, welcome to the Miller Center.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's a great pleasure to be here for lots of reasons. The first might be that when I first decided to embark on this project, I needed an introduction to the Miller Center and to the University of Virginia, and one of your members of your president's cabinet was kind enough to provide that introduction, and one of the first people I met here was Mark Silverstone, who just coincidentally happened to be working on a book about the Kennedy in Vietnam. So we immediately had a connection, and Mark has been a huge help to me all along, from the research to the writing, and eventually to running into Nadine Zimmerli of the UVA Press and telling her about my book, which led to its publication by the university. So it seems very fitting that we're doing this event. And I'm also delighted, because she was so helpful to me over the course of the research, that Lindsay Nolting, Fritz's daughter, is here with us today as well. And she's been a great source of strength. Understandably wary of my project, but generous with her time and respectful of what I was embarking on. So thank you all, and I'm ready to talk about the book.
So let's start with origins. Clearly, these events made a lasting impression on you, the events from 1961 through 1963. Or if it didn't make an impression on you at the time, at least you had recognized that it was a seminal moment for your family. So when did you start thinking about writing the book? How long had it been gestating?
It had been gestating really since the moment that my mother told me on an airplane trip from Saigon to Hong Kong a few weeks after the Noltings had left Saigon, of the breach between my father and Fritz, which was the first intimation I'd had of it. I didn't really start thinking about writing about it then, but some years later, when I was in my 20s, David Halberstam, who was the New York Times reporter in Saigon at the time, and who famously wrote about all those events in his 2 books on Vietnam. I happened to be involved in his speaking in Greensboro, where I was working, and we went backstage for a moment before he went on, and he said, you know, this would really make a great novel, and he started jotting things on an envelope. So that was in 1977 or so. So probably at that point, I began thinking about writing this story as a novel, and I'm so happy I didn't, because it's so much more interesting as a nonfiction book, and there was so much that I didn't know at all until I began work on this book here in Charlottesville in 2017.
The subtitle of the book, Friendship and Betrayal, 2 huge themes that run throughout. Let's start with friendship. Could you sketch for us the ties between Bill and Fritz, between the Noltings and the Truehearts, that get them or take the story up to 1961 at least?
Yes. Bill and Fritz were both Virginians. Fritz was born and grew up in Richmond, and my father in Chester, Virginia. They, at least as best I can make out, their friendship began when they were in graduate school here at the university. They were going to be professors of philosophy, so they were both philosophy graduate students here. I learned in my research, in fact, that there was a connection that I had never known about, which was that my father's father and Fritz's grandfather went into business together. Essentially, I believe the older Nolting bankrolled my grandfather's starting the Bank of Chesterfield. There's no evidence that Bill and Fritz knew each other as kids or anything like that. In any case, they wound up here in Charlottesville, and instead of going on to find teaching jobs, they went to war, not with each other. They went to war.
Yeah.
Bill in the Army Intelligence and Fritz in the Navy. And Fritz was 9 years older than Bill. And after the war, they were civil servants working in the State Department, but not yet Foreign Service officers. In the mid-50s, they both joined the Foreign Service, and they were both assigned to Paris, where the United States, where NATO headquarters was at the time, before de Gaulle threw the U.S. out in the 60s. And Fritz was the number 2 in the U.S. mission to NATO in Paris, and Bill was his number 2. He was the number 3 in the mission. And so our families were all together in Paris for those years, 4 years in our case, that we were there. That's where I was baptized at the American Cathedral in Paris with Fritz and Biddy as my godparents. Then my father went off to other assignments, but in 1961, Fritz was still in Paris. He was named ambassador to South Vietnam, as Mark said. And a few months later, when he got to Saigon, he asked for Bill, my father, to be his deputy. And so we moved to Saigon in the fall of '61.
At that time, so you got there in October-ish, I believe, of '61. Fritz and the Noltings got there in May of '61, right around the time that Lyndon Johnson had made a trip over to try to cement ties with Godin Diem, ties that had been fraying for a bit. It seemed as though the Nolting mission and the Kennedy program was righting the ship, and Nolting and Trueheart were carrying out a policy that escalated even in a word, into 1962. Sense that the policy was going well from their mutual perspective?
I think that's the evidence that I've seen, which is that they were certainly on the same page. And after all, it was the page of the United States government. It was not just their decision to decide. It was not just their decision what to do about Godin Diem. But I think there were reasons for optimism. The Strategic Hamlet program, which you can read a little more about in my book, was beginning to get off the ground. There seemed to be quite a bit of progress, and we've learned later that, at least in Hanoi, the events of 1962, so the year before the crisis, were considered by Ho Chi Minh to be a victory for the United States, that they thought we were doing better than many Americans thought. That's in retrospect that we know that. So I would say that by the end of 1962, things looked like there might be a light at the end of the tunnel, to use that expression. Although there were, as you'll read in the book, there were plenty of people in 1962, if not earlier, among them John Kenneth Galbraith, who believed that this was the wrong path, and that this government in South Vietnam was not worth supporting, and that U.S. interests were increasingly at odds with the direction that the war was beginning to take.
As we turn into 1963, though, things change. Right? There are a series of developments that look very unpromising for both U.S. policy and particularly for the way that the South Vietnamese, both the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam as well as the policies of Diem himself, seem to be faltering. What happens there, and where are Fritz and Bill in their appraisal of those?
Well, I would say the two significant events before the more dramatic events of the spring of 1963 were a mission that Senator Mike Mansfield made to Saigon and the report, the conversations he had with journalists as well as diplomats there, he brought back to Kennedy a very gloomy report about the way things were going. And that was followed by another important moment in early January of 1963, when there was a small battle, you might even call it a skirmish today, called Ap Bac, in the village of Ap Bac, in which the South Vietnamese were routed in a chaotic fashion, and the American advisors, as they were called then, spoke bluntly, off the record, but bluntly to American newspaper reporters, saying that it had been a disastrous performance by the South Vietnamese army. So that began to color the thinking in Washington. Did Fritz and Bill have their disagreements at that point? I can only imagine that they did, although Fritz's view months later was that there had been really no daylight between Fritz's and Bill's view of things until late May. I think it's pretty clear from the evidence that Bill was beginning to express himself in ways that made it clear he was among the doubters about this process and about this government. But at least as Fritz saw it, Fritz was very open to debate in his own mission. I think it's worth saying that he may have been surrounded by people who didn't see things quite as positively as he did, but he allowed that kind of debate to go on, and even to show up in the telegrams that were being sent from the embassy. So even the State Department and the White House might have been able to tell from what their own representatives were sending them that not everybody saw things exactly the same way.
There was a moment, too, during the Mansfield visit back in December that seemed to suggest that perhaps Bill Trueheart was coming to some different conclusions, even closer to where the journalists themselves were. I'm also thinking about events in the early part of '63, and their respective approaches. Fritz being a can-do person, glass half full, optimist. Bill perhaps not so. The style that they brought to their job as ambassador and as DCM perhaps affects the way that they are able to convey, and so much of their job was messaging at the time. Mm-hmm. How do they communicate what's actually happening? Is that a significant dimension of this relationship, their very personalities?
Well, I think that's probably true. It's worth saying that my father never spoke to me about any of this, and so whatever I've discovered about his views and Fritz's views, I've discovered through my own research and mainly through oral histories that they gave. There's a scene during the Mansfield visit in November or early December of '62 where they're all sitting around the table, the country team, as it was called, the leading American officials in Vietnam at the time, with Senator Mansfield and the other senators. And someone asked the question, Claiborne Pell asked the question, what's the view, Mr. Ambassador to Fritz, what's the view of how people in the provinces, Vietnamese people, feel about No Dinh Diem? And Fritz, to some laughter, says, why don't you answer that, Bill? And he turns to his old friend and his deputy, and Bill says, I think out in the boondocks, most people have no idea who Diem is. And Mansfield was pissed off by this. He thought it was a an impertinent remark and a false judgment. And at the end of the trip, according to what I write and what I've read in other accounts, Mansfield comes over to my father at the airport and says, as they're leaving, and says, "I think you're right." No, he didn't mean, I think you're right about Vietnam policy. I think he just meant, I think you're right. This is a government that's out of touch with the people, and if there's going to be any hope of beating the Viet Cong, of resisting this insurgency, it may not be in the best hands with the ruling family.
But that's not the real break between your dad
It isn't.
and Fritz Nolting. That comes later, and that comes in the wake of the Buddhist crisis, which begins in May of 1963 with a melee on the 8th of May, in which several Buddhists are killed, and their efforts to try to patch up relations. The Americans are certainly interested in doing that, although there's a question of who the Buddhists are at that time. There's this political force that the Kennedy administration was not quite familiar with. But the Buddhist crisis continues to mushroom and escalate, and that sets the stage for the betrayal part of the story. Can you highlight the trajectory of events there?
Obviously, I go into more detail in the book, but I'll try to say it as briefly as I can. The Buddhist crisis blows up in the beginning part of May of 1963 with this, the deaths of 8 people, including children, in the city of Hue. And the immediate efforts of Fritz Nolting and Bill and everybody else in the embassy is to try to get the government, the Vietnamese government, to make reparations, apologize, make some moves towards reform, travel to Hue to make peace with the Buddhists, who had not been a known political force in the country, just a latent one until then. The waters seem to be calming just as May comes to an end, and at that point, Fritz Nolting is scheduled to leave Vietnam on home leave, on a well-deserved break with his family, and there was some talk that he might cancel that vacation because things were becoming very tense in South Vietnam. But in the end, he went ahead with his vacation and was away from Saigon from about the 23rd of May until about the 15th of July. And it was during this period that the real explosion came, when the first of several Buddhist monks, or bonzes as they're called, set himself afire on the streets of Saigon, just a few blocks from my house, and a few blocks from the Nolting's house. And this was an explosion that shocked John F. Kennedy, among many others. And it was particularly shocking to Kennedy because, as America's first Catholic president, he was, and one who was facing significant unrest in the American South in those very weeks, is suddenly confronted with a potential disaster in South Vietnam, and the person in charge of the U.S. mission during those crucial weeks was Bill Trueheart, and during this time, Fritz Nolting is during much of this time, Fritz Nolting is on vacation on a ship in the Aegean Sea with his family, with Lindsay and his sisters, and so not in touch with what's going on in the news. And it was during this period that instructions came from Washington that we need to make much stiffer, blunter warnings to President Diem to fix this problem, because it was distracting from the war effort and showing the fragility of the regime. I think it's here that we begin to see that although the policy is beginning to shift and the patience with Diem is beginning to wear very thin, that John F. Kennedy didn't want to be pressured and didn't like everything he was hearing. And one of the first, when my father delivered one of the first stiffest warnings, President Kennedy was very upset by this. He didn't really like the way that looked. On the other hand, things kept getting worse, and the instructions continued. By the way, this was all in a continuum. It was not as though Fritz Nolting had looked the other way. But I think, to go to your question about their different personalities, I think Fritz was a much warmer, mellower, and much more upbeat, optimistic person who was doing what he understood to be his job. That is, he'd been accredited to this government with the instructions to support this government. So during this period when Fritz and his family are away, Fritz and Bill don't speak. That is to say, Bill doesn't bring Fritz into the picture about what's going on, and Fritz, for whatever reason, doesn't bring himself into the picture. It was possible for him to be in touch with the State Department to find out what the latest was. It was possible to read the news. I don't know how much he was able to do that or wanted to do that. And there was a lot else, as I discovered looking at the International Herald Tribune, for example. Fritz says in one of his accounts, in his biography, I think, that when he picked up the paper on a stop in Mykonos, I believe it was, there was nothing about this Buddhist uprising. Well, there was all this other stuff going on. The day after the Buddhist self-immolation, Medgar Evers was murdered in Mississippi. There was a lot of different kinds of news going on, and it's very possible that all those thousands of miles away, Fritz didn't know all that was going on. But I think I know he was particularly upset that his deputy and his old friend didn't get in touch with him to tell him what was going on. And I think it's not conclusive, but I think it's probably the case that the State Department didn't want Bill to communicate with Nolting. The State Department didn't want Nolting in the picture because I think they had a more tractable envoy in Bill Trueheart, and also one who probably agreed with their increasingly gloomy view of what was going on.
And so Bill's perspective as charge, as the man in charge when the boss is not around, he believes that he needs to carry out Washington's policy, and not necessarily the policy of the ambassador, recognizing that the two of them were differing. And it's that sense of loyalty, that sense of misplaced loyalty from Fritz's perspective that lies at the crux of at least that element of betrayal. There will be others, but at least that element of betrayal.
I think that's right. I think that's right. It's fair to say that Fritz may have taken out some part of his anger later on Bill, but his real enemies, Fritz's real enemies, were in Washington. That is, the people who'd lost confidence in Fritz were Averell Harriman, Roger Hilsman, who was the Assistant Secretary for Asia, Mike Forrestal, who was a White House aide who had the president's ear on this issue and who was very close to Bill. I think there were a lot of forces arrayed, against Fritz, not personally at all, but the policy was changing, and Fritz was sort of left behind because he was associated with a policy of rapprochement, of positive reinforcement for President Diem. And now the line was getting a lot tougher, and they had someone willing to be tough in Bill Trueheart.
But the broader representation was changing too. It wasn't just that Bill Trueheart was either coming around to the Hillsman, Harriman, Forrestal, probably George Ball view too, but also that a decision had been made after the 2-year tour of duty was up for Nolting that there would be new representation in Saigon in the person of Henry Cabot Lodge.
That's right.
And Fritz and the family hear about this while they're on their travels. That couldn't have gone down too well.
No. It was a very rude and clumsy move to not tell Fritz that this was coming, and to essentially to relieve him of his duties while he was on vacation, and to announce the appointment of Henry Cabot Lodge. But as my research in the Nolting archives here at the University of Virginia told me, that Fritz had said from the get-go that he only wanted to go to Vietnam for 2 years because he wanted to be sure that his 4 daughters, were getting a good education. And in fact, before he went to Vietnam, turned down the ambassadorship to Laos because of the schooling that was afforded. So it's a funny thing that's actually hard to figure for the historian, because Fritz wants to leave. He's asked to be replaced in an orderly fashion that spring, and he's being told by the State Department, no, you stay on, we need you to stay there. We don't want you to leave at an important time like this. And then as soon as he goes on his vacation, they say, okay, yeah, we actually do want to get rid of you. And so it was a shocking manner in which they carried out what I believe Fritz wanted all along, but he didn't want to be treated as shabbily as he was.
So Lodge comes in. I believe his appointment is announced in June, and he's scheduled to arrive in August. The Buddhist crisis continues to roil Saigon and other cities, and Lodge ends up arriving, and perhaps the greeting party is arranged such that when he does arrive, martial law has been declared in Saigon and elsewhere. The pagodas are raided. So Lodge lands in during this incredibly tumultuous time, after having met with Kennedy and talked about what's coming. And it's one of the many conversations I know that you had a chance to listen to and to factor into your work. How does Bill get along with Lodge? Do they see things the same way, especially since Lodge is coming in apparently with much of his mind made up about what needs to happen with Godin Diem?
That's true that Lodge, I think Lodge understood, and we know from the recorded conversations of their White House meeting that Kennedy says, we're going to have some big changes coming up. They're kind of talking using code language, but it's pretty clear that that Lodge is being sent out to ease the way towards a change of government, regime change.
If that's what Lodge sees, that it's necessary.
Yes, there is some wiggle room, but he doesn't waste much time. He gets there, martial law has been declared, which in some ways gives the U.S. even more cause to, so the Buddhist pagodas are raided by the ruling families, thugs and secret police all over Vietnam, just as Lodge is arriving, and And that's when this famous telegram is sent from Washington, essentially giving the green light to the coup, saying if you, Lodge, can't get President Diem to get rid of his brother, we won't go into all the weeds here, but his brother No Dinh Nhu was the kind of eminence grise of the regime. And his brother's wife, Madame Nhu, was also a loose cannon who was speaking to the press and causing all kinds of other problems for the government and for the U.S. government. Lodge comes in and very decisively carries out these instructions and says he's going to be doing it on his schedule, his way. Now, it's clear from the oral histories that my father gave that and even from the time, that my father was very impressed by this man who had an outsized reputation long before he came to Saigon. And of course, they saw eye to eye about the regime. And so I think they got along very well. And I have to say, I think it was a kick for my father to be working for this, celebrity ambassador that doesn't say anything about his friendship and admiration and respect for Fritz, but he certainly, he and my mother were very happy to be in the aura of this charismatic politician who was the new ambassador in Saigon.
Yeah, just a reminder to write questions on the index cards if you'd like, and just hold up the card. Alfred Reeves will grab it from you and bring it on up to me. It's at this time in late August when the first inklings of a coup are really coalescing, or the movement toward a coup is coalescing. And Nolting is back home in the States at this point, and JFK is very solicitous of him. He wants him to attend these meetings that are held in the last week of August. And it's an extraordinary moment because you can hear him really kind of giving the floor to Nolting for minute after minute, and JFK just doesn't usually do that. I mean, he does. Sometimes Bobby gets a lot of play, and you can understand that. But this is really remarkable. And a question occurred to me, reading your work and thinking about these tapes, is Kennedy on board with the Nolting approach, as opposed to the approach that many of his advisors seem to be pushing, which is going in the other direction? Do you have a sense?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from the record that Kennedy was agonizing over this and would wake up one day feeling more like Fritz and other days feeling more like Trueheart, you might say. And he didn't like it when Bill put the lash to President Diem in June. On the other hand, he thought the policy wasn't working. It's a very interesting moment when, after this famous telegram, after the Buddhist raids, finally the White House ex-com is discussing what's been on everybody's mind, but no real discussion has been had of it. And it's clear that the movement is going towards a coup, towards the kind of pressure that would lead to a coup, to green-lighting the South Vietnamese generals who said they wanted to carry this out. And in the midst of that, what looks like a consensus is building. Kennedy, and I know this thanks to the wonderful work of the presidential recordings at the Miller Center, Nolting says, Kennedy says, let's get Nolting in here and he will hear what he has to say. And so Nolting comes in and is part of this council. You might say, if you think that they were heading towards a coup, you might say Nolting was being asked to play the role of the devil's advocate, or really a more saintly advocate in this case. And hearing out and Kennedy wants to hear Nolting out, hear what he thinks of the generals, to hear what he thinks about New, about Madame New, and so forth. And he really has the floor. And it's at this point that Averell Harriman, who was the Undersecretary of State and no fan of Nolting's and a very grouchy person, lays into Nolting in a way that shocked everybody around the table. And Kennedy upbraids Harriman and asks Nolting to go on. I must say, everything else, all my other research was in transcripts of oral histories, books, and telegrams, and so forth. But to be able to hear the voices of these people, unfortunately not my father's voice, but to hear Fritz's voice, which I remember so well as a child, and to hear Kennedy and all these other leading lights of the Kennedy administration having it out about Vietnam in the early days, it's quite a dramatic experience. So thank you for that.
Yeah, please. The coup doesn't go off, right? The
At
generals,
first,
At first, the generals get cold feet. And so we move into September. Kennedy delivers that famous, or has a famous press conference in Hyannisport with Walter Cronkite, in which he is essentially calling on the Diem government to change policy and perhaps personnel. It's a little nudge in a certain direction. But they're really at sixes and sevens over where to go. He doesn't have a great sense. We'll continually send fact-finding teams out that bring back mixed messages. They will do so in early September, and they're more or less forming around a consensus opinion at the end of September and into October, which is some of the material that I write about. But it's during this time, after the ex-com meets, that Nolting sits down and writes what at the time was called an efficiency report, right? After he's back, kind of an exit interview. And he writes about the relationship between himself and Bill, and Bill's performance on the job. Could you talk about the efficiency report? We had talked about one betrayal earlier. Here's the other betrayal.
Right. Yes, this is the other side of the coin. And I think if you didn't know what had happened afterwards or didn't know the context, you might have looked at this two-page letter that Fritz wrote. Actually, he wrote it in August, but I don't think Bill got it until late in September. In which has a very nice cover note from Fritz to Bill saying, "I thought you should see this. I had to put it this way. Love to Phoebe and the kids," and so forth. Very friendly. And in that letter, he says, I think actually very diplomatically, very gently, that his deputy was disloyal. I think Fritz meant that Bill had been disloyal to him, or that might have been what was on his mind. But I think in that era, if a diplomat was accused of disloyalty, anybody would have to think of the 1950s and the whole McCarthy era, when loyalty to the United States was something that people were being tested on and accused of disloyalty and so forth. In any case, it's my opinion that this was a surprise to Bill that Fritz felt this way, and he took it very badly. And it's for that reason, as Mark said, that they never spoke again to each other, and that Bill, he didn't really forbid me from coming to Charlottesville, but he said, "You won't go to the memorial service if you care what I think." which was another way of. But he was leaving it up to me, but not really, I guess. I mean, I was practically 40 years old when he said this, and it was the first time he'd ever spoken of this whole thing, ever. So it made an impression.
So just a tangent on that for a second, because you had noted that your dad had relayed the business with Fritz, as it was called, to Josh, your brother. But
well, he just said it's all in the Halberstam book. He didn't really explain it to Josh. He just said, go look in the book. And that, to me, was a way of saying, to me too, I stand by that version of events. Yeah. And as I say in my book, the Halberstam book, The Best and the Brightest, made a huge impression on me because it was the first time I knew about what my father had done and what had happened with Fritz. When I read that book in 1972, so 9 years after the fact, I was in college. So Bill obviously was a source for Halberstam, not just in Saigon during the events we're describing, but I know for a fact that he talked to Halberstam about his book. Hard to know because Halberstam doesn't source anything in this very important book. No index. Well, I guess there's an index, but no footnotes. So yes. So the phrase "the business was with Fritz" was the only way Bill knew how to speak of this breach.
Yeah. The forces for coup again coalesce late October, early November. The coup goes off on November 1st. Ziem and Nu are assassinated the following morning. You're a 12-year-old kid in Saigon. There are guns blazing, and you can hear all this. What do you remember from those 48 hours or so?
Well, I was very lucky that when the coup started at noon on Friday, the 1st of November, that school got out very early. I went to the American school there. School got out early, and I was already at a friend's house at, say, 1 o'clock. And my father called his mother and said, the coup is happening, can you keep Charlie there? So I got to spend the night with my pal, and my father, of course, spent the night at the embassy, so my mother was at home alone with her toddler, just a few blocks away. And yes, we could hear the boom boom all night long, and I remember standing on the roof of my friend's house and seeing I didn't know what tracers were, and watching all this go on. It's worth noting that, this was obviously more serious and more dangerous than anything I'd witnessed in Saigon. But for the previous 2 years, I had the run of the city as a 10, 11-year-old, 12-year-old. My parents and the parents of every other kid I knew, unlike parents of my generation, just said, well, be careful. off you go. And so it was actually unusual for my father to be concerned about where I was and to have called up and said that. So by the next morning, all was quiet. The coup was over. How I actually learned the outcome, I actually don't remember. But I do know that afternoon, on the 2nd of November, my friend who I'd spent the night with and I went out to survey the damage and to collect shell casings and things that we found, an old torn beret and things that we found on the street. And the statue of the Trung sisters, who are the founding sisters of Vietnam, but the statue had been made in the image of Madame Nu, had been pulled down onto the street, and there's a picture of me standing next to that. And it made me think when the statue of Saddam Hussein came down, many years later, it was kind of the same image.
And were you aware during this whole time, obviously the events of November 1st and 2nd are quite dramatic, but you having a sense of what Dad was up to, of the increasing agitation, I mean, were you conscious of that, or were you?
Oh, I was very aware of it. I read the newspaper. I followed the news. It was hard not to be very aware of everything that was going on. These congressmen and senators would come and stay with us, and the Washington people were always staying in our guest room. It was hard not to be very aware of it, but of course, from where I sit today, I was pretty clueless. I mean, I certainly didn't know about any troubles between the Noltings and the Truehearts. That was a complete surprise. But also, well, of course, I know so much more now.
Yeah.
So
the Noltings leave in the summer
in August,
of '63. The Truehearts leave in '64. Could you
January,
say January '64? Could you talk a little bit about departure and how that went?
Well, I think in general in the Foreign Service, when when a new ambassador comes, usually the DCM, the number 2, leaves not long after. The new ambassador, just as Nolting did, wants his own team there. My father also, during the course of the fall, had been offered a significant promotion back at the State Department, a promotion offered by one of these people who was a Nolting antagonist, Roger Hillsman. And so we thought we were going to be staying until the following summer, but we left in January. We left rather quickly. I don't think it was because my father and Lodge didn't get along. I think it was just time. And also, suddenly, 3 weeks after the coup, we have a new president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, who had been one of the people in the room who thought a coup was a very bad idea. And yet it was Johnson who then had to deal with the consequences of the coup. And I think there was a great sense, but also by November it was becoming clear in Washington that Henry Cabot Lodge, though he may have been in tune with the general idea, was a terrible manager and would not take instruction, and was an arrogant person who wasn't going to take any orders, especially from the guy who beat him in the Senate race 20 years before, John F. Kennedy. And so they decided they needed a new strong deputy to kind of really run things in Saigon. And I think it's true that my father's reputation had been tarnished by the military, who were very pro-Ziem, the American military. And it was just better to start with a new person. And they hired another DCM who came immediately and who actually only lasted 6 months, another very able, distinguished Foreign Service officer named David Ness. So we went home on the 16th of January of '64, and by the time we got to Washington after our own long holiday, the guy who was going to be my father's boss had resigned and left the administration. So my father's career was, he was given charge of Southeast Asia as had been promised, but Vietnam was removed from the. It was split off, and my father always said that he was given the dominoes, and Vietnam became its own office, which made plenty of sense since we had a war going on there. On the other hand, they had somebody who knew Vietnam, but they gave him the non-Vietnam parts of it. But I think he would say, and I would certainly say, that he caught a lucky break to not be further sucked into Vietnam at a time when his generation of Foreign Service officers were almost like Iraq in a later era, everybody had to go do their duty in Vietnam, even if it was running the 6th Corps in the provinces. In other words, it became a huge American embassy and a huge sinkhole of careers.
But aside from not talking about the business with Fritz, did you and Dad talk about policy as it was shaping up during the course of the 1960s?
Not much. He certainly, I became, when I got to college in the late 1960s and became of draft age, it was pretty clear to me that my father didn't approve of the war. He was still in the Foreign Service, but he didn't have anything to do with that policy. And I think it troubled him deeply. And I think that part of his being troubled was that he had a son of draft age. And the idea that I might go back to Vietnam in uniform was perhaps a scary thing for him.
Yeah.
But we didn't know, we didn't talk about it much. And you know, because I was in college, I knew more than anybody else,
Right.
especially him.
You had become a minor celebrity.
Right.
Given that you were name checked,
Yeah.
or your father was name checked.
My name does appear in The Best and the Brightest.
Yeah. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and the questions from the audience are really interesting. I had another question about sources, but maybe we can turn to one of these. What's the best story from the manuscript that your editor made you cut? I thought that might be a fun one.
Well, there's so many.
Yeah.
I was talking about one to my wife in the car on the way over today, which was Kennedy and Lodge discussing Madame Nu.
Yeah.
I won't say any more.
Yeah. But we'll let you listen to that if you'd like, free of charge.
No, I mean, I think I had a superb editor, and she made the book much, much better. I can tell you that the last section of the book, in its original form, was much longer and dealt much more with my experiences after Vietnam in relation to the Vietnam War, my return visit to Saigon in 2016, a few things like that. But I quite agree with Nadine and with others who read the manuscript that once the events of 1963 are done, everything else is kind of it's another story. It's a later story.
Yeah.
But I don't think. I mean, maybe Nadine would like to say. But anyway, no. I think it worked out well, and I don't think there's too many outtakes on the floor.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
Recently, Richard Haas, the past president of the Council on Foreign Relations and a diplomat who had served in multiple administrations, described Charlie's book as a great foreign policy story of bureaucratic fighting, infighting actually, and regime change, which highlights themes that we're still wrestling with, especially what happens when the United States lacks a reliable allied partner in an area of significant strategic interest. In other words, the story that Charlie has written is one about the past, present, and likely future of America in the world. So please join me in congratulating Charlie on writing both a timely as well as a timeless book. Copies are available.